they say misery loves company, but so does really any behavior that we know isn't right and other people around us are doing it. It gives us permission to do that behavior.
You are a warrior.
321 status. What kind of vehicle is it?
You are the very best your nation has to offer.
911. Multiple shots fired.
They're asking you to lead.
5. We need a Bearcat.
It's up to us.
So 133. I need somebody that's got a visual on where the shooter is.
You must be sound in mind, body, and spirit.
40 feet, where's the officer down? I have a rescue helicopter that wants to land and help.
This is the podcast that will make you the one.
Copy, running eastbound.
The one that will bring everyone back.
Trouble, we have shots fired. Give me backup now.
Because no one else is coming.
We're going to have an officer shot. 100 block of East Street.
Suspect is down.
This is The Squad Room.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Squad Room podcast, where we learn how to serve, strive, and succeed in our challenging careers as first responders. On this show, we cover the tactics and strategies you can use to lead with vision, honor your oath, and take care of your mind and your body, and be the one in someone else's time of need. My name is Garrett Tesla. I'm a full-time sergeant for a sheriff's office in Southern California, and I am on a mission to build a world where first responders wake up inspired, feel confident at work, and go home safe, knowing they've spent their time in a worthy cause. I start every episode with that statement. At least I have, since it struck me that that is why I am doing this and why I go through this process. Because I really, truly believe that the way to solve all of the issues in policing is to create a profession where people wake up inspired, when they can feel confident at work, when they can feel safe in the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they have, and when they can go home knowing that they've spent their time in a worthy cause, something that has been worthy of committing their life to. If we can do that, we will win this. We will win public opinion. We will resolve many of the long-standing issues in leadership in our agencies. That is the way forward. So that is why I read that every time, as much as a reminder to myself as it is to you. All right, before we get to our guest, I'll remind you of a few things. First, if you're on social medias, make sure you're following us at the Squad Room and that you've liked our Facebook page. But something else we've gotten a huge response to, super excited about, Tactical Tuesdays, our weekly email list. If you want to get on the email list, you should, because there's a couple things you get. One is Tactical Tuesdays, which is every Tuesday I send out 3 to 5 tips, tactics, strategies, things that I find useful, things I think you'd like to help you get through the week. It's a quick little email. It's got some links in there to check out maybe some gear, maybe a book, maybe a quote that I'm pondering, maybe a training video that I think is useful for a briefing topic, whatever it is. But we do that every week, and you can sign up at thesquadroom.net/Tactical Tuesdays, or check the show notes for a phone number you can text your name and email address to. That phone number, 805-364-2331. But also, that mailing list also gets additional exclusive content emailed to them that I don't share on the podcast, that I don't share on social media. It goes only to those people on that list. And it's often long-form emails with some idea that I'm exploring, a thought, maybe some training that I think would be useful. So make sure you get signed up for the mailing list so you can get those as well. All right, my guest today is Jen Satterly. Now, the last episode, you heard her husband, Tom Satterly, on. Tom spent 20 years in Delta Force. I hope you listened to that episode. If you didn't, I suggest you listen to that one first, because it'll help inform the talk about Jen. Jen wrote a book, Arsenal of Hope, Tactics for Taking on PTSD Together. Jen, being Tom's wife, met Tom after 3 marriages fell apart, and how Tom was in the throes of his biggest struggles with PTSD after being in the Battle of Mogadishu and being on the raids that helped capture Saddam Hussein in Iraq and so many other missions. Tom hit rock bottom, and as he said in his interview, he didn't just hit rock bottom, he grabbed a jackhammer and kept going. And Jen met him right in the throes of that. Jen has her own story of trauma that she had to deal with, but also as the relationship with Tom developed, she of course had to take on this idea of managing his PTSD too, and to the point where they almost got their marriage annulled the next morning after they got married because he had an episode, and his anger was just out of control. So Jen wrote this great book. She writes in her book about how special operations soldiers just kept coming up to her to talk and would open up to her about things that they would never tell anybody else. And I can totally see why. She's a fantastic human. She is very easy to talk to. She was a great guest to have on. And we just talked at length about not only what the spouse can do to help support the person who is experiencing the trauma on a regular basis, like a law enforcement officer, like a firefighter, like a medic, but also what we need to be aware of as the sometimes perpetrator of a pissy mood, of anger issues, of those things, and how what we do informs the lives of our loved ones, including our kids. And I tell a story I'll save for the show. I tell a story to Jen that to this day crushes me about something my son said to me when I didn't realize he knew what was going on. So check it out. Her book is Arsenal of Hope. It's really, really great. You can get it on Amazon, and I highly, highly recommend it. So here we are with Jen Satterly.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So on the last episode, we had your husband Tom on, and we heard his journey through, I don't know even how to describe it, through through hell, I guess,
Yeah.
in many ways, right? But I asked to have you on at the same time because I thought there was a lot of value in your story, and so much so that you wrote a book yourself, Arsenal of Hope: Tactics for Taking on PTSD Together. And the emphasis in that title is in, I think, the together word. And so I wanted to have you on because your story is as incredible as his in a different way. But with, it struck me in reading your book how you and Tom found each other, but also then how it sounded, it sounds like just the journey that you two started together. So I guess I
Yeah.
don't want to, I can just dive right in, I guess. But before we talk about the journey that you two ended up in together, again, we heard about Tom's journey, but tell us a little bit about yours up into the point where, you and Tom met.
Yeah, sure. So, I spent my career in advertising, film, and photography. So I spent my adult life owning my own studio and working with various clients. One of the clients that was brought to my table was special operations. And the funny thing is, I said no the first 3 times. I just didn't, at that time, I'm like, I don't really know anything about special operations. I had shot some sports stuff. So, being able to shoot on the fly and shoot action was basically how I got into working in special operations. So I ended up having my client was a ranger, former ranger, Army Ranger, and he basically said, I've already signed you up to go on this project. I was already doing other work with him. He's like, just go on this one. If you don't like it or you don't want to do it again, obviously no big deal, but I need a camera person. And so went to film and met Tom, although Tom and I always laugh because I don't think we spoke 2 words to each other during the filming of that first project. And I, in fact, ended up talking to his son a lot, Thomas, who was 14 at the time. And so I filmed this project with them. And really what I became interested in was for the entertainment industry. A former unit member of Delta had gotten out. He started a company that was basically like you train with special operation guys and then you go shoot zombies in big hospitals and abandoned buildings. And he ended up opening a place out in Vegas. But this was to be, why I was there was to film essentially the commercial for it. And Tom was one of the guys in it. So he was miserable. He didn't like the entertainment side of, what he had just come from a 20-year career in Delta Force, 22 years in special operations, 25 in the Army. So it was a huge shift for him. For me, it was another project, another client, but I really became interested in spending just a little bit of time with these guys. Like, hey, tell me more about what you do. And they, one of the guys said, hey, you should come on one of these exercises and see it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, can I? And they're like, yeah, we have role players and civilians sometimes interact when we do these really big RMTs or realistic military training exercises. So I'm like, I want to come. Sign me up for that. I want to see it. Can I bring my camera? And they're like, yeah. And I said, can I film? And they're like, well, that typically doesn't happen. But I kind of approached it with this guy who owned a company. Like, hey, I did some work with St. Louis Cardinals and various other major league, kind of sports teams. They film everything. They film everything and then they review everything. And actually, the Cardinals have this cool room down in the basement where they review every pitch and every play. You guys should do the same. I think it could really help. And so the first 2 times I went on an exercise, I had my entire film erased. Like, I spent all this time filming, and then I had a guy come over who was a young captain, and he was like, I need you to delete your entire card. And I'm like, no, we have permission from command. They know I'm here. And they're like, yeah, it came from command. So you need to delete the entire card. We need to watch you do it. Went through this whole big rigmarole. And honestly, it only made me want to do it more. It's just my personality type. So yeah, that's kind of right up to where I met Tom.
So, obviously then eventually a relationship forms and in that relationship, that's kind of where I want to start the discussion from your perspective as either the girlfriend or the spouse, or in terms of what were the first red flags you saw that gave you pause.
Yeah, honestly, I think I had an advantage in a lot of ways because when I met Tom, I was also working alongside guys just like Tom. So even though I went from one world, which was the creative arts world, into the military world, like you really probably couldn't have swung the pendulum farther away from where I was, who I hung out with. Even my ex-husband, we remained good friends to this day, but totally opposite from Tom, like totally. So everything was a red flag to me because everything seems so incredibly different. I noticed that Tom, probably the first thing that really stood out to me was he drank a lot and he was angry a lot. And it was like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of situation because he could be very, very charming, funny, outgoing. He could make everybody in the room laugh. But I mean, you could snap your finger and just like that, everyone in the room is stopping with the laughing and stopping, with the good times, literally with a look from him. He just has this presence about him. But I think the difference was it wasn't just anger that was showing up, it was rage. And, I had seen rage before. I was raised with an abusive mother who had untreated PTSD. So I recognize that. I recognize the rage as hey, this isn't just I'm getting angry at the car that cut me off. It's he wants to drive that car off the road now and then take him out of the car and, beat him up. Of course, he never did that, but he could go from 0 to 100 in a second. And then I noticed a lot of the guys I was working alongside the same thing. Charismatic, funny, charming, and then snap your finger and it goes to a bad place quickly. And I thought, okay, this is something bigger than just some anger issues, or this is something bigger than, these guys are drinking the bar clean. What's going on? And the funny thing is Tom was never diagnosed with PTSD, even with his very long career, countless deployments, countless missions in the hundreds. So that was a shocking thing for me, was that he wasn't even diagnosed with it.
There's a story in his book about going into and getting a doctor, and the doctor saying, "Oh, you can't have PTSD because you answered, was it like yes, no?
Yeah.
You answered no on a yes, no question, and if you
Yeah.
answered yes, you'd have it, and if no, you didn't." And it was that black and white to this
Yeah.
doctor, and he kind of walked out of there scratching his head. Um,
They
it
asked him if
strikes.
he would go back,
What's that?
and they asked him if he would go back.
That's what it was, right? Like, would you
Yeah,
go back?
and
Would
he
you
said
go
yes.
back to war? And he said
Yeah,
yes. And I think, and his description of why he said that makes perfect sense to me. Because if you're being called or asked to do something on behalf of your brothers or your
yeah,
country, like, yeah, you don't, like he says, you don't want to, but yeah, you'd go back or you'd
right.
suck it up and deal with it. I mean, I can't think of how many times, like, as a first responder or as a cop, like some extended critical incident, some major natural disaster, you get that day off finally, and you get the call like, hey, I know you said we know you said you had the day off, but we need you back. Will you come in? And it's like, yes, yeah, I will. And
Right.
you have that awkward or
Loyalty.
horrible conversation with your spouse and say, I got to go in. I thought it was so.
Yeah,
So you're seeing a lot of the same behaviors from this group of people, all of
yeah,
these special operations Delta Force guys, and you're seeing it consistent throughout them. And slowly people are coming to you. These guys are coming to you to kind of offload or to
yeah.
unload some of this angst. What was it about your presence, do you think, that made you a safe space for these guys? Because I imagine some of them were married, right? And they couldn't
Yeah.
have that conversation with their wife, or they refused to, but they came to you. What was it about you that you think drew people to you?
I think that's a great question. I think I was anonymous, to a large percent or large percent of the population. And not everyone, of course, but feels that they can't go to their spouse because they really don't want to bring the war home, even though it's in the home, even though they're carrying it with them, even though they're trying to hide it, it's still there. And so I think for me, it was like, hey, I could tell Jen, I'm never going to see her again. Like, hey, it was me and sometimes 60 guys, and so I would be with this team anywhere from 6 days to 20 days. And over time, I'm a tomboy kind of girl. I also was very professional and respectful, so I kept a boundary, I kept a distance, and I think that earned their trust. I wasn't trying to be like one of the guys. I wasn't trying to get in there. I was always very respectful of the role that they play for our country, the importance of what they do, and the seriousness of what they do. So I think over time, honestly, not trying to insert myself into the community allowed me into the community. And then from there, it was, hey, I could dump all this stuff on Jen. She's not part of my team. She's not part of my command, and she's not part of my home life.
Do you think, because you have your own story of PTS too, that already had kind of developed by the point that you were at, and I'd like you to go through that a little bit, and then I guess my follow-up question to that is, do you think, like is attracted to like, or a pot, you know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like, so
Yes.
walk us through how you ended up with, or where you got to the point where you realized you had your own PTS journey you had to deal with.
Yeah. I found out I had PTS through Tom's diagnosis of PTS.
Hmm.
So I always joke that my PTS was attracted to his PTS, but there's a truth in that. And we actually find a lot of times with first responders or veterans or active duty military, their spouses also come from some sort of trauma. There's just some sort of attraction and comfort into knowing someone. And it's a very subconscious thing. It's not like I was like, oh, hey, here's a guy who's pretty screwed up from some war stuff, and I'm pretty screwed up from some childhood stuff. Let's be, two trains going a million miles an hour, and let's just crash into each other. But that's what we did. Reckless behavior is a huge part of untreated PTS. And so for me, it manifested a lot of times in my college years. And, I think that can look like a normal expression, just like in first responder and military community, drinking and reckless behavior can look like a normal part of that community. So, I'm in college and everybody else is going to frat parties and, burning it down. And so was I. But really, for me, I had taken it to a level that had gone too far, and I knew it had gone too far. And I think I think a lot of us 80s kids kind of raised ourselves. My friend calls us the feral cat generation because we really were the first generation where our parents went off to work. Both parents, you know,
Right.
our mothers were in this generation of, hey, it's time for you to get to work and for you to prove yourself as a female in the workforce. And I know my mom certainly embodied that. It was very important for her to be successful and to prove her way. And, her untreated PTS from having a schizophrenic father um, didn't result in really reckless behavior for my mom, but the way it manifested for her was very aggressive and rage based and perfection driven aggression, which we see a lot. So the same things that kind of Tom, there's something out of order in the home. There's the cup in the sink, there's crumbs all over the floor. There's disorder. The brain with PTS will read that as you've got to get control over the situation. The way Tom and my mom responded was with anger and violence. The way I responded with secondary PTS was it was to withdraw, retreat, make myself small, and then to express that hurt and pain through substance abuse and through just reckless, stupid behavior. And when I saw that in Tom, I think me having kids kind of evened it out for a couple of years for me is I really wanted to be the opposite parent that I had. So I became the helicopter mom. I became the mom that volunteered for every activity at school, field trip, room mother. And, really went to the place of I'm going to try to be the perfect mom. Um, but when I met Tom, it was a lot of that PTS kicked back up again, a lot of the reckless behavior. I talk about in my book that I almost lived two completely different lives. One life at
Mhm.
home, and then one life when I was out on these realistic military training exercises for weeks. And honestly, I saw the attraction of service and being in first responder and having this tribe and going through adversity together and building these really strong bonds through that adversity. And so, when Tom started working on his PTS, I had a therapist say, okay, well, you need to work on your PTS and secondary PTS. And I'm like, what? Me? And so the sad thing is, I will say most spouses I talk to have no idea what secondary PTS even is, or that it is a thing that spouses and children can have it as a result of a family member having it. So really, a big part of my book is what I want to do is education and awareness. It's just, hey, this thing's out here. This is how it can manifest in your life. This is how to heal and start healing from it because it takes time. There's no magic pill.
You know, there's so much in there that I want to dig into, but to be respectful of your time, I'll tackle the biggest one first, which I think is that secondary PTS. And you just said something that I think is so powerful that we as specifically cops, but first responders, all first responders, firefighters, all of us, that our spouses and our kids are affected by the work we do. And even if you don't bring it home, if you don't tell the war stories at home, if you don't talk about your day, um, what you said earlier, that sort of foreboding presence of anger and rage or distance and being checked out, those things create an environment for our families that is unhealthy for them. And only with hindsight do I realize that there was some experience there for my family as well. And I'll tell a quick story to drive home maybe the point. Um, so in 2019, I've mentioned parts of the story before on the podcast, but in 2019, we had a boat sink off of Santa Barbara called the Conception, and it was a overnight dive, scuba diving trip. It caught on fire in the middle of the night, and 34 of the 39 people on board died.
Oh,
Well, my job as the dive team supervisor was to coordinate this massive multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional, um, federal, all the way down, middle, military, federal, state, local. Everybody was involved in this
wow.
response, and it's 22 miles out to sea, and I'm the guy on scene as like the guy in charge. Obviously, there were other people above me in charge of running the big thing, but in terms of figuring out how to get and recover these 34 people, my job.
Um,
So this is like a 14-day event, right? So as I'm going back and forth, and I'm working 20-hour days, and we don't have TV in the house, so the kids aren't watching the news. And so it's not on top of their mind, but they're in school. People talk in school. They overhear conversations I have when the phone rings, and I pick up and I start talking. I'm on my way out the door one day. This is like day 3 or 4. And my son is sitting on the couch, and he's got this really sad look on his face. And he says, "Good luck today, Dad. I hope your boat doesn't burn like the other one."
wow.
My son was 8, right?
Oh,
So here he is internalizing and processing these things, and obsessing and thinking about these things, and developing anxiety over these things, having never said anything to me or giving me any indication that he knows about what's going on, that he knows what I'm doing, or that I'm going to be on a boat. And for an 8-year-old, like, well, one boat burned. Why?
yep.
Makes sense that another one might, right? So that's an easy example of how our jobs, even when we work to protect the family from them, uh, affects them, And of course, none of us want to do that to our kids. And I think it's obvious for us to say we don't want to do those things to our kids, but we often are less conscious about doing those things to our spouse, I think.
Yes.
And so I wonder, you talked about how you had this kind of like double agent kind of life, where you're, super mom at home, and then you go on these excursions, and it seems like being around other people with PTS gave you some permission to engage in some of that other PTS reckless behavior.
Yes.
Do you think that's true?
Yep. Oh yeah. I mean, they say misery loves company, but so does really any behavior. Any behavior that we know isn't right and other people around us are doing it, it gives us permission to do that behavior.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I absolutely started with I'll have a drink to why am I drinking to a level where I'm blacking out and I'm 39 years old? This is crazy. Like I've got to get it together. But
Hmm.
yeah, there is a permission in that sense. And actually I saw that in many reckless behavior patterns, as far as one time I was helping a SEAL, he wanted to work on his marriage. It was really breaking apart. There were issues. He's telling me how much he loves his wife and his 2 daughters, and he's showing me pictures. She's beautiful. Their kids are great. And then a couple nights later, we were all out. It was the end of the iteration. So there's the client side, which is the agency that I worked for, which is all former special operation guys anyway,
Hmm.
former unit or Green Berets mainly, and then the client, which are the SEALs. And so that's the point in time where you kind of mix socially. The exercise is over. It's before they have to go. And so he walks up to me at the bar and he was like, we're talking for a minute. And he was like, hey, look at that girl over there. Like, she's pretty hot. And I'm like, yep, sure is. And he's like, kind of joking with me to be a wingman. And Tom always says, see, that's how comfortable they got with you, is they forgot, who you were, and that, you were on the outside of it, and that you really don't put up with that stuff. So, he said, he was kind of joking about me being his wingman. And I said, listen, man, do what you're going to do. You're an adult man. But don't ask me for help with your relationship and then turn around and ask me to help you pick up a girl. Like, this behavior, and it was totally accepted. Everyone else around the bar was, I don't want to say everyone, that's not true. A lot of people around the bar were doing the same behavior and doing the same thing. So yeah, when we surround ourselves with people who are doing things we know kind of aren't right, but they're doing it too, it definitely creates a sense of permission for sure.
So therein lies, I think, one of the key struggles of recovery, or in navigating this, is like,
Yeah.
here you are part of, and this goes whether you're special operations, or you're a cop, or you're a firefighter. You're in a tight knit group
Yep.
of people with a shared purpose, with a shared mission, who are working under sometimes life threatening situations. Certainly
Yep.
not as frequently as Delta in the middle of Iraq, but nonetheless, you're working in these situations. Your system, your fight or flight system, is turned on all the time,
Yep.
but that is your tribe. And so how do you suggest, or how do you tell your clients and your people, how do they extricate themselves from the reckless behavior and from the negative aspects of it while still remaining a member of the group? Because that's so important to so many of us, right?
Oh,
That is
yeah,
our identity, and it
for
shouldn't be our
sure.
only identity, but it's a huge part of our identity. How do we pull that one piece out?
Man, it's generational. It's going to take time because right now the culture supports toxic behavior. It does. Tom and I, we'll call it the culture that kills because when you look at the numbers, right, there's 5,669 soldiers, sailors, and airmen who were killed from the global war on terror. So from 2001 to 19 was that statistic. In that same amount of time, there's been roughly 62,000 suicides. So when we talk about who's the greatest enemy of the American soldier, when you just look at the numbers, the story tells itself. We're killing ourselves at a greater number. It's the same thing with law enforcement. I know the numbers have gone up this year as well. We just did a speaking engagement with Utah SWAT, and a lot of the things that you talk about, bringing it home and the culture and the tribe, and how do you still stay part of that when the tribe says we're all going to the bar and this is where we're going to decompress, this is we're going to talk about what just happened, maybe there was an incident. um, there there is an acceptance of substance abuse that's just part of the culture, but the problem is that also leads to the highest rate of suicide. So when you look at 90% of veterans are committing suicide not only when they're drinking but when they're at very high toxic levels. So we're saying, listen, it's not that a lot of these guys even want to commit suicide. We believe a lot of these suicides are frankly accidents that happen because they're so incredibly intoxicated. So this is where all of these pieces come together. Relationships. 89% of the suicides are happening after a family disturbance. So when we look at this reckless behavior, the alcohol, the maybe the affairs that are coming in, or just really gambling or other things that are taking our quality of life and reducing it. When you look at around the room and everyone else is doing it, you're like, well, this is normal. This is normal to me. This is normal to our tribe, even though it's resulting in death. I mean, that's a pretty big consequence: divorce, death, financial ruin, all of these things. So Tom and I talk about, you have really got to pay attention to your surroundings and you've got to get control of them for your best life. And that might mean that you're quote unquote the nerd who isn't going to the bar that night, or you're the guy who they're like, I don't really understand why, like Tom would say, if I had a drink for a lost brother, I'd be drinking half the year. I just can't do it anymore. I don't want to do it. I don't want to honor them that way. I want to honor them in a more respectful way. I still will take time out that day. I will still take a moment in their honor. And then I'm going to live my best day that day for them, not, sit in a bar all night, because that's not what any of them would want for me.
Mhm.
So I think it's going to take generations. It's going to take leadership stepping up saying, hey, you know what? We shoot to get better. We do close quarter battle. We practice that 1,000 times a day to get better. We work out to be stronger. We run so we can beat the enemy. Mental health has to be part of the equation, just part of the equation, like everything else. You don't have to make it more special, but it needs to be included. And so until that happens, the reckless behavior is going to continue until leadership starts standing up saying, hey, this stuff is killing our guys more than the enemy or more than a gangster on the streets is able to do. We have got to address this because we respect the human in the uniform too, the
Mm.
person that has to do the job. And like you said before, the families fully understand, they fully see it. Children are smart, they pick up on it. And it's almost like that conversation. We've heard it over and over again. If I talk to my kids about suicide, am I planting the idea? Then actually, no, you're not. You have to talk about the tough stuff. You have to talk about the things that are uncomfortable. And like I said, we were talking to Utah SWAT earlier this week, I think it was. One of the guys said, listen, Jen, you keep saying I need to talk to my wife. I need to bring her in. But frankly, after like a 12-hour shift, the last thing I want to do when I walk in the door is talk to her about my day. But she feels left out and resentful that I'm not sharing, this huge part of my life with her. And I said, hey, make a plan. Make a plan to talk. It doesn't have to be every day when you get home from work. Can you make it once a week? Can you commit to that? opening up 1 time a week instead of 5. And he's like, yeah, I could do that. Okay, well, you and your wife come up with a plan, but you've got to be so honest with her. You've got to say, it's not you, it's not the kids. I had a long day, a tough day. When I get home, I need to decompress. I need this, this, and this. And then she could say, okay, I understand that. For me to feel part of your world, I need to hear what's going on. I don't like to hear from the other cops' friends' wives, which I hear a lot. Like, I heard from a wife that this was going on at work, and why didn't you tell me? Well, he needs to decompress. He needs to put his oxygen mask on. You need information. Maybe Tuesday night is the night where you guys get together and you unload, or maybe it's Saturday morning coffee. Whatever plan it is for you, it's like with everything in life, you have to have a plan. You have to have plans in your relationship too.
What? That's all great advice. And I want to drill down into that spouse and warrior, for lack of a better term, first responder, operator, military relationship. I think a lot of I say guys, but I mean men and women who
I do too.
wear a badge or a uniform. A lot of people who are in the professions are fearful that their spouse won't understand.
Yeah.
Not only understand their response or what they're feeling or how they're feeling, but like understand like the depth of what they went through. Even if it's just a single day, a fatal car accident.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
um, my wife's a very empathetic person, and so
Mhm.
if I not that I would ever tell a story of a fatal car accident, because that would drastically upset her and affect her, but her thought would be to, of course, the victims, which I
Yeah.
think is naturally what people go to,
Yeah.
the victims of the accident, that how awful for their families and all those things. And as a responder, you eventually turn that off, which I think
Yeah.
is dangerous. You turn off that empathy for the people, because you have to, because otherwise you're just not going to get through the day.
Yeah.
um, and however, when we come home and we're kind of internalizing those things, I think that you know the first response is the empathy towards those families without empathy towards us, and we're afraid that
Yeah.
we're not going to get that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It makes absolute sense.
So how does a spouse who wants to help and wants to be engaged, how do you start that conversation with a guy who wants to? I hear that all the time too. I just want to come home, tear off my vest, and like sit on the couch and drink a
Yeah.
scotch, or be
Yep.
by myself in my office for a half hour.
Yes.
That's important, that decompression. However, you're right. People need to have a conversation. I think they need to schedule it. Like,
Yeah.
okay, Sunday
I do too.
morning, 10 a.m.
Yep.
It's in our iPhones that we're
Yep.
going to talk about this. And then I'm always the guy going, "Ah, great."
I know. And you're gonna hate it. You're gonna
Like, I
hate it
hate it.
probably every Saturday night. You're like, crap, tomorrow morning at 10, I gotta talk with my wife about all this stuff. But I mean, relationships aren't always fun. And they do require a lot of work.
But it starts the communication, right? And that's
Yes.
like the first step. So I know that there's so many spouses out there who are just running up against a brick wall
Yep.
of not being let in. But for the people that are listening who are primarily in those professions, what is the first thing from your perspective? What's the first thing they can do, or maybe an easy step they can do to let someone in and say, hey, you know what, today was tough, or today was or I've been feeling this way for a
Yeah.
couple weeks or a long time, or I'm scared about this. What's that first thing they can do?
Yeah. And that's a big first thing because, I get a lot of calls from spouses. Recently, I got a call from someone. Tom and I went to speak, and when we speak, usually floodgates open for a little while after. And true here, high-ranking military special ops guy, and here's Jen saying, "Share your story, share it with your spouse, so open up." So one day he just came home and opened the floodgates, and she wasn't prepared for that. And so now I adjust when I talk and say, first, ask permission. Can we have this conversation?
Mm,
I need to talk to you about everything. Because he opened for 3.5 hours. He opened up about every single deployment, all of his friends he lost, some of the very some of the things that he was holding close to his heart that he regretted or that he felt shame about overseas.
Mhm.
And he'd been holding this for 20 years. So from a wife's perspective, she was a little angry. She's like, "Why for 20 years? I'm your spouse and you never shared any of this with me." She was sort of hit totally by surprise. It was like a frying pan to her head. She was not ready for this conversation.
Mhm.
So I'll back it up by now saying, "Hey, you have a plan in place and then you've got to share that plan, and then create it together." So a different conversation could have been for him is to come home and say, "You know what? I've had this wall up for the last 20 years and it's been a measure of protection for me. I have been in survival mode for 20 years because this is what it takes to do my job. I feel like I'm ready to start sharing some of the stuff that happened overseas with you. It's probably going to take a couple hours and I don't want the kids home when we do it. Can the kids go to your mom on Sunday and can we have that time to talk?" And then she's going to say, "Oh, okay. Well, yeah, Sunday works and can we talk about it now?" I mean, maybe the answer is no. Let's wait till Sunday. Let's talk. I'd like to kind of let you in. Because frankly, after the frying pan moment for her was how do I process this 20 years of information?
Mhm.
So maybe even doing it in bite-sized chunks versus a kind of all at one dump. Some people need to do it in front of a therapist. There might be infidelity or some other issue, gambling or loss of money or something that directly relates to your spouse that you need to kind of come clean with, or you need to say, "Hey, as part of this reckless behavior bit that I'm starting to understand that comes with the stress of my job, I've done some things. I need to talk to you about it." Might be better to do that in a therapist office, somebody to kind of help you through some of those more tricky or difficult conversations. But I will tell you, I haven't heard anyone who has opened up and shared regretting it. Not a single person. In fact, a former unit guy had called this past week and said, I went downstairs and saw your book on the table and about crapped myself because I didn't want my wife to read your book. And she went on Amazon and ordered it anyway. And I was like, "Oh my God, oh my God." And he said, "I literally broke into sweats because it took me all of it, a day and a half to read your book. I read it online." And he said the infidelity part I was terrified about because I was unfaithful, not to this wife, but in my past. And I was afraid of her asking me about it and that she wouldn't love me anymore or trust me anymore, or it would cause a barrier in our relationship. So he had been holding it for years, felt like this dark secret between them. And
Mm.
he said, after he goes, "So she read your book in about a day and said, 'Can we talk?' And he's like, 'I'm sweating.' And he said, we ended up just crying together, and getting it all out. And I told her everything. And he's like, 'We are closer now.' And he's like, and this weight has been lifted off of me, even though it didn't have anything directly to do with her. I was afraid of judgment. I was afraid she wouldn't find me integrous anymore. I was afraid some of the things I did overseas, she might judge me for those things." And what most people find out, I say guys too, but I mean guys and gals too. What most people find out is that these guys have a life that is complicated, is something that's really big. Most of us spouses will never understand it unless they do it as well. And even then, we have veteran, or two law enforcement officers who have totally different experiences. They handle stress differently. So it doesn't even match up when you have cop and cop or veteran and veteran, because we're all unique and we all handle stress differently and it's all biology. So, really being able to come up with a plan for your spouse. I get it, how you fill that cup up when it's empty, and you guys have empty cups all the time. You guys work in your battlefield. I hear stories all the time. We do a ton of stuff with law enforcement. Last night, the guy was talking about how he was in a restaurant, or I'm sorry, he went into a Walmart with his two daughters. It's 8:30 in the morning, and the guy he arrested the night before tried to jump him. And he's like, "This is my life, and I've got my 5-year-old and 6-year-old with me. And so you guys never leave your battlefield, and you have your families in it with you." So it's, I think, even more important for our first responders, our law enforcement, to have open conversation and dialogue about this is what the job is. And this is why sometimes when I come home, I need to go into the bedroom for an hour and sit by myself because I'm not really ready to talk to you about my day. It's nothing to do with you, honey. It has everything to do with how I need to process this day. And this is what I need. And when you can take that, taking it personally out, which she's going to take it personally, or he, when you're like, I'm just going to go to the bedroom. Well, I haven't seen you all day. And you go in with a scotch and
The kids are
turn on,
screaming and they want to see
yeah,
you. Yeah.
like, can you help me? But once she understands what you need, and you ask her likewise, what do you need from me? And maybe it's just I need to hear, maybe not even the details of the fatal car accident, but us spouses want to know how it made you feel, you know?
Yeah. I think that's great advice to ask permission,
Yeah,
before you dump. Because I think the natural reaction afterwards, like you say, is going to be somebody who, upon hearing horrible things, it creates their own fight or flight response,
for
even if
sure.
it's just a story about something or something significant or a story about you, and their wall's going to go up, and they're going to have a reaction instead of a response. And
Yes.
so I like that idea of like asking permission to to unload.
Yeah.
Um, and then how does how does a spouse or significant other, a parent even, or an adult child, how do they, because like I'll never know what it's like to be special ops, to be Delta, right? I can read all the books, I can talk to you and Tom for hours. I'm still not going to know what it's like. Um, Conversely, I think the same goes the other way, right? Like
Right.
Tom or you will never know my experience or the idea of being a cop. You have a really good idea, right? I mean, you have a good
Sure.
grasp of it. You know cops, you know the community, but the day to day is intangible to anyone who hasn't done it, right? Including our
Yep.
spouses. And
Yep.
so, how does the spouse create space for trying to understand a job without bringing their judgment to it? And maybe not
Mhm.
judgment's maybe not the right word, but like
Yeah.
you just mentioned. um Here's another story real quick. This just happened like 2 days ago. um you mentioned the cop who arrested the guy, and then the next morning he's at
Yeah.
Walmart with his kids, right? So we're driving down the street a couple days ago. I live in my jurisdiction, so I deal with that kind of stuff all the time. Thankfully, no one's ever tried to jump me in Walmart, but I've definitely made eye contact with a lot of people and told my wife, I'll meet you at the car, or let's
Yeah.
go the other way. And so whole family's in the car on the way to the beach, and we're driving down the street, and there's this guy who I've dealt with for years and years and years, who has significant mental illness, who just kind of rides his bike around the neighborhood, yelling and screaming, cursing expletives, and screaming at people. He's terrifying if you don't know his backstory. He just looks terrifying. He looks terrifying.
Yeah.
He screams at you. He uses kind
Yeah.
of challenges people to fight, and he's just
Oh my god.
he's out of his mind.
Yeah.
And my partners were dealing with him daily because someone's always calling 911. He's in the middle
I
of the street
bet.
screaming and ranting, right? So he doesn't live terribly close to me, but he lives close, like a bike ride close. So
Mm.
sure enough, we're at a stoplight. He rolls by yelling and screaming at everybody. And my kids are like, what's his problem? And I was like, oh, I won't use his name, but oh, that's so and so. Don't worry, he's got some mental illness, and it's an opportunity to talk about mental illness with the kids, of course. So training opportunity there. But
Yeah.
then almost subconsciously or reactively, I mentioned to my wife, and I shouldn't have said this with my kids in the car. I don't think they heard me, but you'd be surprised what they do here. But I said this almost to my wife in an attempt to kind of let her in, to
Mhm.
share something with her that I hadn't shared before. And I said, I almost had to fight that guy on the day his dad died.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
because we got a call that his dad wasn't breathing. I'm the first in the house. He's mentally ill.
Oh
He comes
god.
in while I'm checking his dad's vitals, and he thinks I killed his
Oh.
dad. So like fight's
Oh.
almost on, and like
Oh, yeah.
with a crazy guy, right? So it's like
Right.
one of those moments where, and I hadn't thought of that story. I hadn't thought of that since
Yeah,
probably since close to when it happened, but it just triggered in my head as
for
he's
sure.
riding by, and everyone's asking me who he is, and I'm like, oh, I know who he is.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I kind of mentioned this or mutter this under my breath, like as a, can you believe that? Like that's kind of crazy, right? And my wife's response was, oh, how sad for him. Wait,
Mm.
that's not the point of the story.
Right.
Like, hey, like here's me
Yeah.
and my ego being like, no,
Yes.
soothe me, soothe my
Soothe
ego. Like,
me.
you should be like, oh, that's horrible for you. That must have been absolutely terrifying because this guy
Yes.
wanted to rip your head off because you thought you killed his dad. Like, that's the response I wanted.
Yes.
And for a split second, I was very upset by
Mhm.
the how she misjudged my statement.
Yes. Yep.
How I let me rephrase that. How I perceived her to misjudge that statement. Here I was asking for understanding of what it was like to be terrified this guy wanted to rip my
Yeah.
head off, and her having never been a cop, even though she was
Yeah.
raised by a cop, ironically, I can't expect her to understand the job the way I do. That's my whole point in that story. Is so she hears it from her perspective and feels empathy for the guy whose dad just died.
Yeah.
How do we ask for that? Maybe that's the way to
Yeah.
ask this question. How do
No.
we as the first responder ask for the empathy to understand what we're going through? Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yes. You guys have been married a long time?
15, 16 years.
Yeah. Cop wives are tough, man,
Oh
too.
man, yeah. Hmm.
I I think one of the scaredest I've ever been to speak was in Daytona Beach. I did a law enforcement wives luncheon, and I'm like, wow, there's some tough women in this room because they have to put their armor up too. And over time, their armor becomes your wife's armor becomes pretty thick as well. And it's a protection measure on their part too. So, a lot of first responders and military will say, like, I don't bring it home, but it's there. You could feel it. There's a thickness to the jobs that you guys have to do. And also, I think so. She's probably a little jaded towards your stories because you've been married for 16 years too. And that's like two accountants married for 16 years are going to do that. So when you've got a really high stress job that's almost a third party in the relationship, it
Oh
truly
yeah.
is. It's like PTS is the third wheel, but it's
Hmm.
there. I did the same thing. I will tell you, I did the same thing. When Tom first started opening up, the first story he shared was the story of Black Hawk Down. He was involved in that mission. And I had asked him, "Can I talk to you about Somalia?" And he was like, "Yeah, sure, no problem." He ended up bawling on the side of in a cafe in St.
Hmm.
Louis, and he was totally freaked out that he was responding that way. He still was in the shove it down, men don't cry, I'm a tough operator kind of guy mentality. He's not that way anymore. But, I started sympathizing with the people he was fighting. Because frankly, I'm a human. And, when I hear of suffering from any perspective, I'm like, oh my gosh, this world is a really dark, awful place. And I can't believe that, these people, would put their 14-year-old son in a suicide vest. Or I can't believe they would do this to their wife and kids. And I feel so sorry for these wife and these kids. And he's like, yeah, but I lost two of my friends that day. And, so I think if you're not involved in it and you don't see it every day and it's not part of, you guys almost had your bubbles burst and we hadn't yet. So you see the reality of the world. You see the underbelly and the dark side, and you see it all the time over and over and over and over again. I'm pretty sheltered. I don't see things like that every day. And I certainly have never been in a situation like law enforcement or military members go through. So I don't have a point of reference. My only point of reference is what I've seen in movies, which we all know about those,
Hmm.
and how honest and truthful they are, and really selling the perspective. Sure. So I would say it's twofold. She has her armor up, and she's probably guarded already, and that's long-term relationship stuff too. But then I would say the second part of it is if you've brought PTS in the home, she might be feeling the same way too. Like, okay, I'll give you some love and some empathy about what you go through at work, but are you giving me any what I go through at home? So there's that give and take. And I hear it all the time. Yeah, but you're home with the kids, and no way a PTA meeting is as tough as dealing with that fatal car crash. But we all carry stress in our lives in our own ways, and it all
Hmm.
manifests in their own ways. And no one's stress is more important or less important than anyone else's. So that's why I always
Mm-hmm.
say comparison's the thief of healing. It's the thief of joy. Because soon as you say, well, your day isn't what my day was, now you've just ruined the whole moment and really taken away the moment for healing, for acceptance, for removing judgment. And that conversation with your wife will happen dozens of times before you guys get to your flow, before it clicks. So have those awkward conversations, have those things where you might feel like, well, I kind of feel like a wussy for saying this, but kind of hurt my feelings. Maybe you could pull her aside in the bedroom, again, disarm her with, hey, I need to talk to you about something. It's not bad, because everybody hears that I need to talk and it's immediately, oh, great. Now what? Hey, I just need to share something that happened in the car earlier. I know you weren't intending to do this way. You've got such a beautiful, empathetic heart. Praise the other person first. I understand you had a lot going on in your day, probably too. The reason I try to open up and share that story with you was because it was really scary for me that day. I was super vulnerable because I'm trying to help this, save this guy's life. This other person who had mental illness didn't understand. I was just trying to help. And so that really screwed me up. Here I am trying to help this guy, save this guy. Another guy's trying to fight me because he doesn't understand. That really messed with me for a little bit. And seeing him today kind of triggered that. And then
Mm.
you don't need to say, can you be more empathetic or can you do this? You've just brought your side of the story into
Sure.
the fold. And a lot of times we don't consider our spouse's stories. We just need to be reminded sometime.
And that goes both ways too. We don't consider their story. I want to touch on two things you just said that I think are important. I see you talk about like the first responders, the cops. We have had our bubbles burst,
Yeah.
but yet other people live still within them.
Yeah.
And I see so many cops, especially, who take an active role in going around trying to burst everyone else's bubble,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, and not in a like, let me shine some light on this so we can all be more empathetic, but more in an aggressive, like, you don't understand the real world. That's the way.
Yep.
That's not the way it is. I've seen things you haven't. You're an idiot.
Yep.
You don't know what you're talking about. We do that. Uh, across the sexes, across political divides, across social structures. We go around like whack-a-mole, trying to burst everybody else's bubble so that everybody else can be just like us. And I think if
Yeah.
we ever gave pause, we'd say, wait a minute, do we really want everybody to be like us? Or do we want to maybe re- replace that bubble in some way? And I think
Yeah.
that we do. Um, and that bubble's not a bad place to live. You don't want to be
No.
naive, but
Right.
I think that when we, the cops, can develop our own empathy towards our spouse more, when
Yeah.
we begin our gratitude practice
Yeah.
and we feel gratitude for the family, for them being here, for making our lunches when we're on night shift, for getting the kids out of the house while we sleep
Yeah.
during the day, when we can practice our gratitude, we start to reform our bubble in a positive way. Does that make you know what I mean?
Oh, heck yeah. I love
And
that you said
then
that.
oh, cool. That's been part of my journey or my approach to like the story I just told about the crazy guy.
Yeah.
My initial reaction was that you don't understand, but I have I have worked on the gratitude aspect of myself to the point where I am grateful that she still sees the world that way, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. You don't
because
want everyone with burst bubbles.
you don't. And like you said, cop wives are tough. Like,
Yeah.
whew,
Super
like,
tough.
and they're often in his service as much as we are.
Yeah.
They're just behind the scenes. They don't get to wear all the cool badges and award
Yep.
medals and all that sort of stuff, but they're doing the hump work of keeping a house moving and keeping a guy on the street. The other thing I wanted to touch on, beautifully said, and I think so many people shirk away from accepting or kind of trying to find a foundation for movement forward is you just said that comparison is the thief of healing. And what a beautiful statement. And I just want to spend even just a minute or two on just that, because I think like right now, I'm thinking about your husband, Tom, right? And I like, I was never Delta. I was never Green Beret. I was never in the military. I don't deserve, quote unquote, deserve empathy or respect or anything as much as he does, because look at what he did, right? Different life. Now that's an easy one for people to understand, but what if we take it down to your own department, and here you are maybe 5 years on, and you're struggling with some things, or you're starting to see some of that reckless behavior. You're drinking too much, or you're surfing the internet way too much, or gambling, or whatever it is, all the different things we can do to distract ourselves.
Yeah.
But you haven't had anything major go on. You haven't had anything significant. But you think, oh, I can't have it because I'm not as tough as like the 20-year-old veteran who's been in 3 shootings, who has also probably gone through 2 or 3, wives at this point.
Yep.
Uh, the old salty guy, but he's the shit magnet for everything. Everything happens to him. He's always in it. Not only the 3 shootings, but how many times has he rolled to a homicide in progress, or a shooting in progress, or infant death, or whatever it is. So I think there's a comparison we all naturally tend towards, to compare ourselves and then belittle ourselves, shrink ourselves down, because we're not as much as that person is. How
Oh,
do
yeah.
we get rid of that comparison and just kind of be in ourselves?
I love that question because I was terrible with judgment and comparison until I started really, really putting in the work to understand it. And one of the things that freed me truly was a couple years ago, I was sitting with who is now our All Secure Foundation therapist, Stacy Stone. She worked such wonders for both Tom and I in our recovery that we hired her. But she sat there and I said, I'm like, I've got to get rid of Instagram. I just have to get rid of it because I'm constantly looking at these 25-year-old fitness models. I'm 45. I'm getting really frustrated at my progress, and I'm working out and I'm doing all this stuff. I'm eating right. I just got to, I've got to get rid of it, or I'm comparing this, and that. And she was like, well, and I also said, and I want to be less judgmental. I'm judgmental. I want to be less judgmental. And she said, well, I have bad news for you. You're a human being, and human beings were built with certain mechanisms to keep us alive. We are built for survival. And so everything that we do is going to be based on survival. So when you look at comparison and judgment, that's a tool that we've been given. Because if we can't judge a situation, we might get eaten, because we still have our caveman brains. Or if we don't compare, is this a poisonous plant or not? We're dead too. So we have comparison built into us. We have judgment built into us because there's survival mechanisms. I think the thing that changed my whole life was I stopped using the language, I'm not going to compare, or I'm not going to judgment, because I'm human. And that's just setting me up for failure, because I am going to compare. I am going to judge. Instead, what I tell myself is, okay, I need to be aware when these things are showing up and why. Why am I judging this? Why am I comparing? Okay, so, and then what do I need to do about it? Because I'm an action girl. If you're going to tell me to do this, and this, it's going to help. Okay, I'm going to say how. Just tell me how, and I'll do that. It's not enough for me to say, well, comparison is a mechanism. Okay, now what do I do with it when it shows up? And so really, I think, and Tom talks about this all the time, because he will get 5 phone calls a day that start out just like you said. I'm a veteran, but only did 1 tour, or I'm in law enforcement and I've really never even engaged in a firefight. So how do I compare myself with other law enforcement officers who have been through 10 of those? And Tom will say, stop. We don't need to compare stories, because your story is unique to you. My story is unique to me. His story and her story are unique to them. All we need to talk about now is how we feel about the story and how to get to the other side of it. That's what's important. We have to share our stories, because sharing our stories is part of the healing process. After that, you got to get to work. So when comparison and judgment show up in your life and you're comparing me to the guy over here, ask yourself why. Why am I comparing? Okay, I feel inadequate, or okay, I'm feeling less than, or I'm feeling this, or that. And then what do you do with that emotion? How do you start processing that? How can you make change around that? So For me, I deleted Instagram. Or for me, I got rid of all the 25-year-old fitness models that I was comparing myself to. I removed that trigger for myself. And I said, anytime I catch myself looking at a 25-year-old fitness model, my process, what I'm going to do is say, okay, good for her. I'm going to praise her. I'm going to say she's putting in the work. She's 25, good for her all day long. When I can praise other people, when I don't have to try to knock them down to lift myself up in that comparison, I know I'm at a great healing place. I know that there's so much room for all of us to be successful, for all of us to have a good, happy life. For a lot of people should be living in the bubble, and it's a good thing that they're living in the bubble. A lot of the products and the things that we use in our life day to day come from people living in the bubble because they don't have to think about war. They don't have to think about the bad guys on the street. They don't have to think about the infant death or the other things that you guys are carrying all the weight of so that others can do their jobs and they can be contributing members to this community. We can't all be law enforcement. We can't all be war fighters. Then we don't have philosophers or artists or doctors. So it's good that some people just remain in that bubble. We want that in a community.
Yes, I love the idea that we want people to remain in that
You
bubble for
said it
that
first.
exact reason. We benefit from it, right? Like, I
Yes.
mean, I'm a huge music fan, and I came out of the music industry before being a cop, and
Awesome.
I love to like when I think of I never connected the dots to think of it that way, but like when I go to a concert, like your big concert, and you see like
Yeah.
the cops walking around, I always thank them because I know that because they're there, we all get to
Yeah.
do what we're doing, and then the band gets to express
Yes.
themselves in a way that I get motivation and vision and inspiration from, and just have a good time.
Yes.
And so I love
Exactly.
this idea that we want to keep people in the bubble because we
We
get
do.
something out of that too, and
Yes.
so that's a great spot. Jen, All Secure Foundation is a, like, tell us your vision for it, and then I want to direct people to your kind of your restart plan that you put out.
Awesome.
I think it's really great. Talk about that for a minute.
Great. So All Secure Foundation, it's allsecurefoundation.org, and then all the social media platforms we're All Secure Foundation as well. So you can find us any which way is most comfortable to you. We do serve the special operations community. We've never turned anyone down. So we actually do a lot of work with law enforcement. We do a lot of work with first responders. And even during COVID, people who have been affected by traumatic stress, we've reached out and helped medical community as well. So even though our website says special operations, don't let that stop you from hitting the contact button. That contact button goes directly to me. So I handle all incoming emails from there. Either Tom, myself, or one of our staff gets involved. So don't ever hesitate to reach out about anything. There literally is nothing that Tom and I haven't heard already. So um, if you need help, if you're looking for some answers, there's resources on our website. There's a ton of great podcasts like yours where you can get great information. And then we do retreats, and we're actually working on building our first brick and mortar in North Carolina. So we're just starting that. Hopefully, we want that to spread across the country too, but that's emotionally focused therapy. So that's that cognitive therapy on behavioral change, which is so important with PTS. It's talk therapy typically doesn't work very well with PTS. We need behavioral change associated with it. So we will have we're calling it Camp Homefront. And it's these cool log cabins all in the woods spread out. So you get to do counseling anonymously. So we'll have events there as well. So we're really excited about that. But make sure to hit us up. Like I said, we're here to help.
Amazing. And for a lot of people, I think, who are looking for that first step towards, they know they need to change.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a little early for them in their journey to seek professional help or whatnot, but they know they
Sure.
need a reset. You have a great 6-week program on your website. It's a free ebook, walks
Yeah.
through nutrition and fitness and some mindset ideas and some journaling prompts, which I think are really great. And they can find that on the website too. And then your book is Arsenal of Hope: Tactics for Taking on PTSD Together, available on Amazon. And again, think it's a great book. It's a great companion piece to to Tom's book, All Secure, because you get a very detailed description of both sides of it. He tells your story together in his book, but you really tell it from your perspective here. And there's a lot of value in understanding it and helping. What I found was it helped me, remind me of some of those empathy traits I need to display as a guy who's 16 years married and wants to stay married.
Yes.
And so it's just great. So I appreciate all the work you do for
Thank
our
you.
community. It's awesome and motivational and inspirational to see people out there, you know, putting their name on it and planting their flag and saying, come with me. So, Jen, thanks for your time today.
Thank
And if
you.
anyone has questions or they can find everything of what we talked about today in the show notes for this episode, just go to thesquadroom.net and you'll see Jen's episode there. Jen, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a blast.
All right. Thanks for listening to this interview with Jen Satterly. Make sure you check out the show notes where you can find all the links to everything she's got going on. And of course, the link to her book, Arsenal of Hope. Every episode I talk at the end about badges, how it relates to our badges, our beliefs, actions, discipline, goals, emotions, and service. And I beat that into your head, yes, because I think that is a framework. It is the framework for how I operate. It's my operating system. Everything I do, I work into that framework. And for me, it's successful. I've had commercial airline pilots email me saying that they use it as their framework because they listen to the show on their long hauls. And even though they have no interest in being a cop, they like the content or they're interested in policing. But they have integrated that. I've gotten numerous emails from psychologists, clinical psychologists, who think that badges is a great way for first responders to frame their lives, frame their challenges, frame where they want to go forward. So I am trying to spread this idea of badges further and further, and I do really use it in everything we do. And I think Jen, when we were talking, so much about her story just goes right into badges, beliefs, and her belief that Tom was recoverable and that she wasn't going to play out being a victim, but she also had to accept her own trauma from her own past, and her own rape as a young woman, and how that kind of informed her relationship with Tom. And, she talk about actions, a woman who took action. She saw this person she thought was worth fighting for and struggling over, and she dove in and learned as much as she could and had the discipline to not put up with some of Tom's behavior. And I think Tom would agree with that and say the exact same thing. But then went out and set goals for how they were going to get through this together and how they were going to achieve an improvement in their lives. And then emotions. I mean, so much of both of their story is an emotional event, or it revolves around emotional issues, and how we manage the emotions and how we accept and adopt them and not try to shove them down is, it's crucial. And then service, of course. Jen's life is now a life of service to a community she never expected to be a part of. She talks to first responders on a daily basis, and she talks to special operations soldiers on a daily basis now. And, she thought she was going to live her life as a videographer and a marketing ad agency exec. And she's shifted to a life of service. And I think it's just phenomenal, and we're all better off for having her around. Again, the book, Arsenal of Hope, Tactics for Taking on PTSD Together. Can't recommend it enough. All right, real quick before you run, I want to offer you something I talked about at the beginning of the show. I want to remind you, Tactical Tuesdays, our free weekly email where we bring you a few tactics, tips, strategies to help you succeed in your week ahead. It may be about a book I want to share, gear I found useful, an inspiring quote, or anything else I think you'd like. To sign up, go to for the Tactical Tuesdays list, go to thesquadroom.net/Tactical Tuesdays, or just text your email address to 805-364-2331. If you didn't catch that, just check the show notes for it, and you can find it there. All right, if you want to support the show, there's a few ways you can do that. If you like what you heard today and got something out of this conversation with Jen, please consider leaving a review on the podcast player of your choice. And if you got a few extra seconds, please consider leaving a comment. It really does help and helps us inform the show in future episodes. Second, share this episode with someone you know, love, or care about who you know needs to hear that. You can share this episode right from our webpage at thesquadroom.net and from most podcast players. Also, join our Facebook group and follow me on Instagram at thesquadroom. There's some great companies that support the show. Please check them out, thesquadroom.net/support. And until next time, take care of each other and stay safe.